Naval Academy Museum and our second Shifley lecture of the semester. If you are here, I want to congratulate you. You've clearly escaped the plague that's been going around the Academy and elsewhere in the country, and I think it's going to take me down here in the next few days, so I apologize, Jason. I'll try not to touch any.
I'm going to stay around the side.
I'd also remind you that on February 11th, Commander Chris Renfro, who's the Associate Chair of the Department of History at the Naval Academy, will give a talk on the Home Squadron, U.S. Navy, and on the North Atlantic Station. Jason Smith received his PhD in American History from Temple University in 2012, where he studied military history with Gregory J.W. Irwin. He has published articles in the Journal of Environmental History and the Journal of Military History. He is currently the class of 1957 postdoctoral fellow in Naval History at the Naval Academy, where he teaches U.S. Naval History. His scholarship examines the intersection of American naval science, the marine environment, and military power. And I'd be remiss if I did not thank the class of 50 who are responsible for the Shifley lectures that we've been doing for the past year and a half. So Jason, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Bob. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for weathering the epidemic as well as the impending snowstorm and the gubernatorial inaugural here. Lots of things going on in Annapolis and lots of other places that you could be. But thanks for being here. Thanks to the class of 1950 for their support of this program and for their support of naval history in general. And thanks in particular to the class of 1957. Otherwise, nor Bill would be here today. So it's great to see that they have a stake in naval history here at the Academy and that they're working to promote that history in wider academia as well. So thank you for that. So as perhaps you've gathered, I'm interested in the role of the marine environment and particularly the ocean environment in the extension of American power and particularly the extension of American empire. My larger work is roughly from 1838, which is the beginning of the voyage of the U.S. exploring expedition through the turn of the 20th century, looking at how the naval science and the Navy's understanding of the marine environment as it's sort of represented in its charts and its hydrography can say something about the extension of American power over the sea and say something in particular about American naval power. So I'm interested broadly here in asking this question: what is the nature of navies in the marine environment? This is a question that historians, maritime, naval, military, even environmental historians have not really asked. And I think it's fundamental to understanding the role of navies, the culture of navies, the way warships are designed. There are all sorts of questions that are tied to the marine environment. The ocean, of course, it seems simple to say, but I think I should say it. The ocean is fundamental to naval history. And I think hitherto it has been largely ignored by naval historians. So I'm interested in talking about this vast body of water that is the marine environment that makes up about 7/10 of the Earth, and it is the environment, of course, in which the United States Navy primarily operates. All right. In order to get at this question today, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about one part of my research, one part of my book project that I'm working on here at the Academy, and that is the Spanish-American War era. I would argue that this understanding of naval science, the challenges of hydrography in a complex marine environment off the coast of Cuba, also Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and elsewhere, is really important to this moment where American empire really comes to fruition in an important way. So if we look at this quote here, for example, from Captain Royal B. Bradford, he's the chief of the Bureau of Equipment in the turn of the century Navy. Bureau of Equipment, sort of administrative head for the Hydrographic Office, also in charge of logistical challenges during the Spanish-American War, coaling, big issue here. Bradford was in charge of all this, and he says in 1903 that the Spanish-American War would have assumed a totally different aspect had the fleet possessed the charts which had been constructed from surveys made since the Spanish War. Now, when I came across this a long time ago, I thought, wow, this is a strange thing. We think of the Spanish-American War as a very short war, a war in which the Navy figured prominently, and a war in which in which American naval force was exemplified. But here's Bradford in 1903 saying the war would have taken on a totally different aspect. Right? So is this in some way sort of reframing or reinterpreting, possibly, the way naval historians and others look at the war itself? And I would argue a little bit. So let's dive into the hydrography of the matter here. As I said, naval historians haven't really dealt directly with the sea, right? I mean, it's fundamental, but they haven't dealt with it. I would perhaps argue that naval historians really haven't dealt directly with it since the work of Samuel Eliot Morison, the great Harvard historian of the mid-20th century, and the great naval historian. Morison writes, for example, in Old Bruin, his biography of Matthew Calbraith Perry, published in 1967, he says, sailing west to the Indies, talking about the voyage of the brig Somers and the coming of the Somers Mutiny, which some of you may be, or the mutiny plot, which some of you may be aware of. Sailing west to the Indies in the winter northeast trades is perhaps the most beautiful sailing in any ocean. And Somers, rolling and dipping in the long swells, had the wind just where she wanted it, on the quarter, to make best time over a sapphire ocean flecked with white caps. Flying fish flashed silver past the foam at her bow. Puffy trade wind clouds raced her overhead, and occasionally one lashed her with rain. No throb of engines assaulted the ear. There were no sounds but the striking of the ship's bell, the creaking of spars and timbers, lines slatting against the sails, and the rush and gurgle of great waters. Every few hours, the square sails changed color, golden gossamer when the last quarter moon rose, polished silver just before dawn, ruddy at sunrise, cream white at high noon. You get a sense here that Morison, who was a sailor as well as a scholar, really appreciated the presence of the sea, and he incorporated it into his work to a great deal. But Morison's vision of the sea here in naval history, I think, is more romanticized than anything else. He sets the stage, but it doesn't really function as a sort of agent of historical change in itself. Environmental historians argue that the nature itself, the natural environment, is really important to understanding the course of human actions. That is, human actions and natural change combined together explain a lot of human history. And so here's Morison talking a lot about the sea, but not doing it in a real analytical way. He's more romantic than anything else. And so what I'm doing here is trying to offer sort of a corrective to this. Of course, the marine environment, we know, does play a really, really important role in the Navy's history. As I said, it seems sort of simplistic, but I have the need to argue this here. We can see this. Here's just one example from the satirical magazine Puck in the late 19th century. This is a cartoon from 1882, poking fun at the Navy of this era, going after the ill-fated Jeannette expedition up to the Arctic, and all the subsequent ships that the Navy sent after the one previous to try and rescue them from their peril. So we see here American shipping in distress, the only place where the American flag may be seen. And clearly the marine environment here playing a really, really important and central function in this sort of public image of the Navy in the 1880s. So just one example, I would argue, of how we can think about the Navy and the marine environment together for good or for ill. So let's jump ahead now to the real topic at hand. I want to talk about the turn of the century Navy, the new Navy, in the context of the marine environment. And a useful way to get into this is by talking about the man himself, Alfred Thayer Mahahm, whose writings, as you know, I think, in this era dominate the emergence of the new Navy. And it's not coincidental, I would argue, that Mahahm is writing about sea power, right? The influence of sea power upon history. He repeats sea power, command of the sea, that overbearing power on the sea. He talks about the sea ad nauseum. So the question then arises, where does the sea fit? Not just in Maham's writings, but in this turn of the century, on the precipice of empire, U.S. Navy. Mahahm actually in his writings doesn't talk specifically about the need for greater hydrographic effort, the need for greater charting of the world's oceans. He talks about the sea more as an abstraction than as a reality. So for example, in his book published in 1890, he talks a little bit about what he calls physical conformation of coastlines, natural productions, and climate. He says the seaboard of a country is one of its frontiers, and the easier the access offered by the frontier to the region beyond, in this case the sea, the greater will be the tendency of a people toward intercourse with the rest of the world by it. If a country be imagined having a long seaboard but entirely without a harbor, such a country can have no sea trade of its own, no shipping, no navy. Numerous and deep harbors are a source of strength and wealth, but by their very accessibility, they become a source of weakness in war. When the sea only borders or surrounds, but also separates a country into two or more parts, think perhaps empire or territorial possessions, the control of it becomes not only desirable, but vitally necessary. Such a physical condition either gives birth and strength to sea power or makes the country powerless. So Mahahm talking about the marine environment here and its importance in a very broad sense. He's painting the sea in very broad strokes. And he says here a really interesting note in 1897, 7 years after the publication of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He talks about his use, his coining of the term sea power. He says, the term sea power was deliberately adopted by me to compel attention, and I hope to receive currency. I deliberately discarded the adjective maritime, being too smooth to arrest men's attention, to stick in their minds. So you get the sense that Mahahm is really using this term consciously. He's coined this term, and it has various meanings here for Mahahm in a broad sense. When it came to actually prosecuting American sea power, and so I want to talk here about the coming Spanish-American War of 1898. When it came to actually prosecuting sea power, the Navy had to and was forced to, by necessity, implement Maham's ideas into reality, and this brought them into direct confrontation with the sea environment. So one of the things that I argue in this part of my research is that we can see the war with Spain as this war in which Spain is the natural enemy, but we can also see the Spanish-American War as a conflict in which the Navy struggled with a marine environment that was, if not an enemy, sort of antagonist that was, in fact, every bit as dangerous as the Spanish were to the Americans. So the story starts out here in Dry Tortugas in January of 1898. Before the war began, the U.S. Navy moving portions of its North Atlantic squadron down into the Caribbean to do some winter maneuvers and probably to keep an eye on the ongoing revolution in Spanish Cuba. A force of American vessels, including the battleships Texas and Iowa, moving from the fleet base at Key West, 60 miles west, to Dry Tortugas, a place that offered a deeper anchorage for the fleet as an operating base, but one that had not been quite so well charted. And so in January of 1898, while the squadron is moving out of the anchorage, USS Iowa, the battleships USS Iowa, USS Texas, run aground on an uncharted reef. There is no significant damage done to these vessels, even though the naval officers in command are pretty worked up about this. Here is Francis Higginson, who is in command of the battleship Massachusetts, who writes of this event to Theodore Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this time. He says, the channels we were using were improperly surveyed, sorry for that spelling error, and improperly buoyed. This is Higginson. We all felt very blue the day of the accidents, and it seemed as if it was not only raining but pouring. It created, too, a nervous distrust of the whole place. And even now, we are all shy of discolored water, whether shoal or sunshine. These men's professional reputations in command of these big, expensive, powerful vessels was staked to the possibility of running aground or not. This was a big deal for naval officers. in the 1890s had spent most of their career just waiting for this conflict here to finally come, waiting for the war to finally come. This was their moment, and here they had to worry not just about the Spanish, but about inaccurate hydrographic charts as well. Higginson goes on to say, "I think it was these accidents, the groundings of Iowa and Texas, and the anxiety about more to come every time he moved his fleet, which broke Sechard down." Montgomery Sechard was the admiral, the rear admiral in command of the North Atlantic Squadron just before the Spanish-American War. Sechard had been suffering from malaria, and Higginson here hypothesizes that it was these accidents that actually caused a sort of mental breakdown and caused him to be reassigned to Washington and bringing William T. Sampson to command the North Atlantic Fleet for the war. All right, so I want to give you briefly just a few instances here during the war itself, Spanish-American War, roughly April to August 1898. I want to give you just a few instances during that naval part of the war in which knowledge of the marine environment becomes key. And it becomes key in all aspects of naval operations, from going in and out of port, as we saw, to an important sort of innovation in naval warfare in this era, that is cutting submarine telegraph cables between islands and back to Madrid from Cuba, as well as landing supplies and intercepting merchant vessels on the blockade. So the marine environment figuring centrally in all of these aspects of the naval war. First of all, in May of 1898, in the cable cutting, the submarine telegraph cable cutting that severs off the island of Cuba from communication with sort of the outside world, and in particularly from the Spanish government in Spain, this is a really important aspect of the naval war, and of course involved accurate or involved hydrographic knowledge to a very precise degree. The man in charge of a lot of these cable cutting operations on the coast of Cuba was Captain Casper F. Goodrich. He says, "No chart that I was able to obtain, no source of intelligence could tell me the very spot to go for the purpose of raising the submarine wires I wish to sever." So you have to imagine sort of going around in these relatively small, shallow draft craft, in some cases motor launches here, steaming around the coast of Cuba in the shallow littoral, trying desperately to see down to the, what here is a relatively shallow seafloor, trying to find these cables, because there was no chart that existed that was at the Americans' disposal that could tell them where these things were in order to sever them. So here in May of 1898, an operation under the command of Lieutenant Winslow off of Cienfuegos on the southern coast of Cuba, trying to sever that important submarine telegraph cable. Here they are in shallow water, keeping a good lookout for rocks and reefs. The boats pulled steadily on. This is Winslow. The inaccurate Cuban charts, and the Americans were using a lot of Spanish and Cuban charts here, giving us little information as to the distance from the land at which we should find shoal water. Essentially what happens here in this cable cutting, the cable is eventually cut, communications between Cienfuegos and the outside world are severed, but Winslow and his men are exposed to Spanish fire on the beach here, just several, maybe 100 or 2 yards off of the beach. Spanish soldiers taking shots at these guys while they're peering over the side of the vessel trying to find these telegraph cables in what is a very prone sort of position. Winslow himself is wounded in the hand during this very important process. But we see here in this what becomes the submarine telegraph warfare that the seafloor itself now, in this new era of naval warfare, is becoming a sort of battlefield, a battleground in itself. There are all sorts of writings after the war. An article that appears in the Naval Institute Proceedings by an Army officer who titles his paper about this submarine telegraph warfare. He titles it "The Influence of Submarine Telegraph Cables Upon Military and Naval Supremacy," a title that sounds a lot like Maham's own book title. So we see this sort of conflation here of the marine environment, this new cable warfare, and Maham's ideas of sea power sort of all merging and converging into into this one moment here off the coast of Cuba. What about the blockade? Blockade of Cuba instituted by the U.S. Navy as early as April, the end of April 1898. We're not talking about Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba here, major fleet engagements by large warships. We're talking about a U.S. Navy blockade of maybe 50 or 60 vessels, shallow draft vessels pressed into service. Anything that you could bolt down a gun on was pressed into service to try and cut off resupply of the Spanish garrison on Cuba. Of course, this required steaming in a complex environment. The island of Cuba, has like some 2,600 miles of coastline ringed by barrier reefs, shallows, coral reefs, shoals that shift with the movement of water. This is a very complex marine environment. It is into this marine environment that the Navy presses its blockade in the summer of 1898. Vessels like the USS Eagle here, under the command of William Henry Hudson Sutherland, off the southern coast of Cuba near the Isle of Pines, sort of southwest coast of Cuba. The Eagle in July 1898 runs into a Spanish steamer named the Santo Domingo, and Sutherland, of course, on the blockade, is very interested in stopping this vessel. Among other things, his crew can claim, if he takes the Santo Domingo, can claim the vessel as a prize, which would be nice for the crew of the Eagle. But Sutherland says this about that event, chasing down the Spanish steamer as it's sort of fleeing into the shallows on the southern coast of Cuba. With an uneven coral bottom of varying depth and with boats sounding ahead, Eagle made slow progress until within about 2,000 yards of the steamer. The steamer stopped, it ran aground. Sutherland sent a boarding party which got to the steamer. The crew had left the vessel. And they decided then to light the vessel on fire. They doused it with kerosene, lit it on fire, opened its magazine up, and let it be a smoldering wreck there off the coast of Cuba, rather than take it as a prize of war. And Sutherland, in citing his reasons to the Secretary of the Navy for this, Sutherland cites the possibility of an attempt at recapture, which I think Eagle could have resisted had it been possible to maneuver a 12-foot draft vessel, that is the Eagle, on those unknown coral shoals at night with rapidity and safety. And we see this same sort of story play out across the blockade of Cuba in these shallow waters. In this case, not impeding the Eagle from taking the Santo Domingo, but getting in the way of the Americans seizing this vessel as a prize of war. There's another naval officer on the blockade who writes about this duty as a sort of comic opera in which they had to fight the marine environment more than actually the Spanish themselves. Of course, all the while with inaccurate charts. Let's move then now to the end of the blockade, the end of the war in August of 1898. Give you another example of the prominence of the marine environment and of hydrographic knowledge in this era. The U.S. Navy planned in August an attack on the port city of Manzanillo, again on the southern coast of Cuba, an important port city, try and close the blockade. There were a number of Spanish gunboats in the waters surrounding Manzanillo. I think I have maybe got I think my opening slide is a chart of Manzanillo. This is what the Americans are up against here. Manzanillo is right here in this area here, surrounded by the Great Bank of Buena Esperanza. You can get a sense here from this post-war American hydrographic chart of what the challenges to navigation look like in here. This whole area dotted by shallows, 13 fathoms, down to much less than that, all over the place, dotted by small cays and coral reefs and shoals. And so the Americans are pressing the blockade into this assault on Manzanillo in August of 1898, led by the cruiser Newark here, with William F. Halsey Sr. As the executive officer and navigator. Halsey writes about this experience in the Naval Institute proceedings. He says, "To those not possessing a local knowledge The keys in this vicinity have a strange similarity in appearance, and as the chart failed to show some that existed and depicted others that neglected to appear, the difficulties of determining positions by bearings can be realized. Halsey said that this was an undertaking beset with danger and possible disaster, and it wasn't, when he said that, he was not pointing to the Spanish enemy, the Spanish gunboats off Manzanillo, but he was pointing now to the marine environment itself. Newark and 5 other vessels nevertheless pressed the attack into the shallows, the bank of Buena Esperanza. At one point, the Newark stops and starts again. The propellers were kicking up coral mud and dirt. They could see how shallow the water was. On their way in, they had left kegs in their wake to show where their vessels had turned in the navigable channel so that they could find their way back once the attack was over. Pressing the attack on the 12th of August, Halsey says that Newark found itself in 5 fathoms of water, which was just about Newark's draft. 5 fathoms, the Cuban pilot, which they employed in these waters, walked off the bridge, indicating that he washed his hands of all further responsibility. He says, it's up to you guys now. Newark had to actually stop and sort of lay to in the deeper water, firing its 6-inch gun at the fortifications of Manzanilla, while the smaller American gunboats, more shallow draft American gunboats, pressed the attack. So here was an instance in which the Americans, again, were sort of beset by this marine environment. The war ended before the Americans could eventually take Manzanillo. It ended an armistice on the 13th of August, which brought about the end of the war. So we can see then here in this blockade of Cuba all sorts of different naval operations. The presence of the marine environment as a kind of natural enemy that American commanders afloat had to reckon with, not just the Spanish, but the marine environment itself. And so I argue that the Spanish-American War, while it exhibited the American command of the sea, albeit over a much inferior Spanish Navy, it did not exactly exhibit a command of the sea environment. For example, just a few more examples here. Off the coast of Puerto Rico, the American invasion of that Spanish-held island. Here's Higginson again, reported that the Massachusetts steamed into 19 feet of water where the chart had shown 66. You can imagine the trepidation that he encountered there. Again, no harm done, but it came awfully close. And then on the other side of the world, off the Philippine island of Luzon, in November of 1899, as the islands there are falling into a Philippine insurrection against American authority there, November 2nd, 1899, the 3,700-ton protected cruiser Charleston struck an uncharted rock off the northern coast of Luzon and sank. No one was hurt in that. The crew got off safely, but here we see a significant loss to American naval power in the Philippine Islands during a crucial part of the Philippine insurrection. And in fact, we can think of, if we discard the loss of the Maine, right, which we know, or we think we know, is not Spanish, the Spanish were not involved in that, and that was before the war anyway. If we discard the loss of the Maine, the Charleston represents the largest material loss to the US Navy during the entire Spanish Filipino-American War, if we want to sort of think about it in broader terms. And this is at the hands, again, not of the Spanish, not of Spanish guns, but of the marine environment. So here's Admiral William T. Sampson, commander of the North Atlantic Fleet during all of this, praising his men for the admirable navigation of vessels under unfavorable conditions. They surrounded an island, he's talking about Cuba, the harbors and coasts of which were not well surveyed. The Spanish-American War brought this realization within the US Navy and within the strategic discussions that were going on within the Navy that the marine environment and hydrography in particular would be an important component of this new expanding American empire in the post-war years. Here's Mahahm, who was a member of the Naval War Board, a sort of advisory council to the Secretary of the Navy, in 1898, writing to John D. Long, the secretary, before any harbors that may be selected as naval stations are permanently acquired, each should be visited. carefully examined and reported upon fully by competent naval officers sent for this purpose in one of our cruisers. And then there's Dewey, the great victor of the Battle of Manila Bay, who emerges out of the Spanish-American War as the most powerful, most influential naval officer in the American Navy. In 1900, he takes command of the new General Board of the Navy. And he says in 1901 here, in writing to Long again, as complete a knowledge as possible should be possessed by the General Board concerning the hydrography of such points as may be utilized for naval bases or are of strategic value to our naval forces in the event of hostilities with a foreign naval power. Dewey says, among other things, without knowing the bottom thoroughly, the bottom of the sea floor or the harbor floor, we lose the benefit of it. This idea that now the marine environment exists in this strategic sense. It was important to to naval strategy and to sort of the expansion of Mahanian sea power post-Spanish American War. So we see a flutter of naval scientific and hydrographic activity after the Spanish-American War. It's brief, but impressive nevertheless. Among other places, the U.S. Navy realizes that the coast of Cuba was during the war and will be probably again an important domain of Mahanian sea power, an important environment over which the Americans want to extend and project their power. So between 1899 and about 1903, during the winter season called the survey season, the U.S. Navy sent 3 vessels, 3 small draft vessels, including that small vessel, the Eagle, that I showed you earlier, that shallow draft vessel, sent those 3 vessels to the coast of Cuba to survey important coastlines and more particularly, important harbors, one of which, of course, was Guantanamo Bay. You all know how that ended up. We see here an American chart that was taken from Spanish surveys pre-Spanish American War of part of Guantanamo Bay. You notice the lines of soundings, of depth soundings here, and the comparative few depth soundings in comparison to the post-war American surveys of that place. Here is Frank Friday Fletcher in command of the Eagle survey of Guantanamo Bay. During 1899-1900, his men surveyed 25 square miles of water, more than 100 miles of coastline, erected 200 signals for surveying purposes, and cast some 25,000 soundings. Each of these represents an individual cast of the sounding lead down to the bottom to measure the depth and then bring it back up again, record it, make sure you've got it plotted in the precise location, right? Because precision is so important here, right? If you're off by a few feet, what are the consequences for a vessel that's trying to navigate these waters? So precision important, 25,000 individual soundings. Under the hot Cuban sun, you can imagine what this sort of work, this sort of exacting work was like. The General Board of the Navy, with Dewey at its head in Washington, interested in what these vessels are doing off the coast of Cuba for strategic reasons. Again, here is Fletcher in command of the survey. He reported to the General Board that Guantanamo is favorably situated. By that, he meant close to the approaches to a proposed Panama Canal, has a fine anchorage for a large fleet of vessels. Meanwhile, Commander George Thayer, doing another survey of Santiago de Cuba, another port on the southeastern Cuban coast, says Santiago is more easily defended than Guantanamo, and he's summoning hydrographic arguments in part for that conclusion, but it is not so easy to enter. So all these sort of environmental factors playing into the larger strategic debate over these places. Where do we establish an American naval base in Cuba to protect a proposed canal? Is it going to be Santiago? Is it going to be Guantanamo? Is it going to be Havana? Havana's a little farther away, not so centrally located. Meanwhile, at the Naval War College up in Newport, the officers there, the students and the faculty are debating similar questions, using charts to do it. debating questions about Guantanamo versus Santiago. Where should we develop a fleet base in the Philippines if we do? Here we see an image from the Naval War College of the newly conceived war game that they're playing there, beginning in the 1890s and really taking on a force of its own in the early 20th century. Developed by a naval officer named William McCarty Little up there in Newport, who writes about the war game, again, which these guys are working out strategic scenarios on abstract charts. McCarty Little saying that the war game accentuates the fact that the strategist's real field of operations is the chart, just as the architect's real field is the drawing board. He was invoking Jomini's maxim that strategy is the art of making war upon the map. He said naval warfare, naval strategy is the art of making war upon the chart. Among other things, McCarty Little says a walk on deck gives no idea where the ship is, but a glance at the chart in the cabin does. In like manner, it is on the chart that the admiral plans and conducts his cruise. The chart playing an important role in strategic discussions here at the Naval War College, in the General Board, and off the coast of Cuba. Naval War College grads. Here's War College grad of the class of 1901, Austin M. Knight, in command of USS Yankton during the 02-03 surveying season off the coast of Cuba, goes back to Buena Esperanza, right, the site of the attack on Manzanilla during the war, try and survey these waters. Are they important strategically to the US Navy in any future Caribbean war with maybe Germany? Who knows? Would these waters be important as a fleet base? And if so, we should probably chart them. Knight, in the ship Yankton, conducts his survey. He writes back to Dewey and the General Board, I know of no sheet of water, and here he's relying on the studies that he's done at the Naval War College. He's thinking about those in the back of his mind. I know of no sheet of water in the world which is in any degree comparable to it, nor am I able to think of any possible advantage in which it is lacking for the use of our Navy, whether for drills in time of peace or for rendezvous and shelter in time of war. I find that 6 fathoms, he's getting into the hydrography here, I find that 6 fathoms may be carried through here and that the channel is perfectly feasible for battleships. It could be closed with great ease and at short notice. And then he says, and he's again thinking about the strategic studies that the Naval War College has done, where they're sending officers out into Narragansett Bay, into Block Island Sound, into Long Island Sound, to talk about the strategic assets of the marine environment. He says here, these waters, talking about these waters off Cuba, seem to hold the same relation to the Caribbean Sea that is held by Nantucket and Vineyard Sounds to the waters of our North Atlantic coast. That is, they are strategically important. Again, drawing on his knowledge of the strategic discussions happening at the Naval War College. All this comes to head in 1901 as the General Board of the Navy, the Strategic Advisory Council to the Secretary of the Navy, is debating the great question of naval bases. This is the business that the great business of the General Board in its first years of operation. Where do we establish American naval presence in the Caribbean and in the Western Pacific? General Board debating this in 1901. They finally come out, again, based on some of these reports from the surveys. They come out in favor of Guantanamo. Here's Robley D. Evans of the General Board summing up their opinion for Guantanamo. Listen to the language, listen to the reasons and justification. By reason of its position inside and adjacent to the Windward Passage between Haiti and Cuba, its commodious and well-protected harbor, and its easily defended entrance, Guantanamo commends itself strongly to the General Board as of the first importance for a naval base in Cuba. American naval opinion in the Western Pacific, around the same time, based on reports from these surveys, based on strategic games being played out at the Naval War College on abstract charts. The General Board settles in the Western Pacific on Subic Bay on the island of Luzon in the Philippines to be its major base in the Western Pacific. Again, here's the justification from Dewey. Subic Bay possesses a capacious anchorage with sufficient depth of water for the larger ships is capable of being excellently defended by fortifications and submarine mines, and has good protection from the prevailing storms of the locality. Mahahm, of course, by this time, sort of irrelevant to these larger debates by 1906 or 07, Mahahm adding his own belief here, again, in terms that accentuate the importance, that identify the importance of the marine environment here. Oops. Oh, that's not helpful. I lost battery. Mahahm, I could give you the quote. I wish I could give you the quote. Mahahm talking again about the importance of the strategic environment, talking about Subic Bay as a natural fortress, as an impregnable fortress, and citing hydrographic and environmental arguments, again, for the importance of the marine environment to the Navy strategy in this era. And ultimately, in 1901, the General Board comes out in favor of Subic and Guantanamo as places from which the American Navy can sort of expand its growing power in those places. And so we see now in the determination of Subic Bay and of Guantanamo Bay as this sort of geography of American empire emerges here, largely based on hydrographic arguments. I don't want to say it's solely based on hydrographic arguments. There are clearly other factors that result in the choosing of these two places. There are diplomatic factors, there are other strategic factors. But what has been ignored, I think, is the sort of hydrographic factors and the role of naval science in the marine environment in that choice. So we see here the geography of the American empire established now in the Caribbean and the Western Pacific. And with really, really important ramifications for what the US Navy and what the United States does in the 20th century to come. Thank you for that help. So I'll just end up with this point here, right? Naval strategists in all sorts of letters and discourse of the General Board talking about facilities afforded by nature, talking about the particular environmental factors that factor into their decisions. Here's Charles D. Sigsbee, director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, who's saying no harbor can now be considered a good man-of-war harbor that will not admit a battleship fleet. There's a General Board report for Samana Bay, Santo Domingo, which the General Board believed in 1901 would be a flashpoint between the US Navy and the German Navy in the Caribbean, saying that Samana Bay is fitted by nature for defense. And I would just sort of leave with this point, that this sort of, the importance of the marine environment in terms of naval history and naval operations is not just a story that goes back into the early 19th century. It's not just a story at the end of the 19th century for American empire, but it also has important ramifications for the Navy throughout the 20th century and into the present day. And so we can talk about the Arctic. We can, as a strategic environment, we can talk about the possibility of an open Northwest Passage by 2030 or 2035 and the strategic implications for the US Navy there. We can talk about sea level rise in places like Norfolk, where the marine environment plays a really central role now, again, in the strategic discourse of the Navy. Here's in the Quadrennial Defense Report of 2010, talking about some of these issues. The Navy's Task Force Climate Change, talking about these issues again. Here's retired Rear Admiral David Titley, once prior oceanographer of the Navy, saying, when I was in the Navy, we tried to strip away the emotions associated with climate change as a political issue. It's a change, and just like changing demographics, political regimes, and economic conditions, we need to deal with it. If we don't, we're putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage, and the United States military never wants to be at a competitive disadvantage. So I would argue that this story has not just important relevance for the way we understand the naval past, but it can be important for helping the Navy today understand sort of the issues that it deals with today and in the future. So I'll end there. Thank you.
We have time for one quick question. Two quick
Sorry.
Two quick ones, please.
Do you see evidence after the Spanish American War of them spending more money on like the hydrography department? That sort of thing?
Yeah. The naval appropriations for the Hydrographic Office spike. They go from like $20,000 a year up to $100,000 a year for that period. roughly until about 1905, and then it begins to drop off again. So we see the importance, the sort of strategic importance of hydrography playing out in sort of dips and spikes throughout the 20th century for various reasons, but largely related to wars. That's a good question.
Could you please address the consequence of having a president like Teddy Roosevelt at the time this was going on, because he was favorable to the Navy?
Sure. There's no question that Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and then President of the United States, was a pro-Navy guy. The Great White Fleet, which I showed you here an image of, was sort of the brainchild of Roosevelt. In advocating for this muscular American expansion, he saw the Navy as the primary tool for that. I don't think he got down into the weeds of hydrography. That sort of thing didn't really enter into his mind, as far as I know. But certainly in the sense that creating this public image of the new Navy as a sort of force for the expansion of American ideals and whatever else, Roosevelt was central in that, for sure.
So as you look, hydraulic office, when was that started? Was that started back in the 1830s with after the XX fleet? Because
Yeah.
they had a place to store all the maps and all the
Right.
discoveries.
Right.
And then that period of essentially the Spanish American War is when the U.S. becomes an imperial power and needs to now start gathering up all this data to be able to operate as a world power fleet. So it makes sense that you would want to put money into your
Right.
your map room.
Part of what I argue in the larger work is that we're not talking about just strategic empire here at the end of the 19th century, but we're talking about an American commercial empire over the seas in the antebellum era too. The American merchant marine and whaling fleet, it's at its height in the 1840s and 1850s, and the Navy in promoting and protecting that is really important, and here scientific work like the XX is really, really important as well. So institutionally, hydrography goes back to the depot of charts and instruments. That was, at the time, just as you say, was just a storehouse for the Navy's navigational tools and its charts. That was established in 1830. It became the Naval Observatory and Hydrographic Office in 1842. It became simply the astronomical duties, the astronomical duties and the hydrographic duties of the office split in two in 1866. And so in 1866, you just have solely the hydrographic office. So that's sort of the brief institutional history.
Now, does that eventually morph to become what we know as, previously knew as NEMA and now into the Defense Mapping Agency?
Yeah. There are various transformations in the 20th century. You have the splitting off of the Navy Oceanographic Office, you have the Defense Mapping Agency, and all these different agencies. NOAA sort of takes over some things as well. So you see this sort of bifurcation and split of the duties into the 20th century.
In air power history, when we're looking at things, as weapons got more accurate, you needed more accurate maps. And you needed to go three-dimensional.
Sure.
And then the amount of data when you started thinking about that.
Yeah. These are challenges that the military faces throughout the 20th century. And you could talk about the amphibious invasion of Tarawa, which infamously we know about the role of the marine environment in that operation. The anecdote there is that the Navy and the Marines were relying on an old chart of Tarawa Atoll from the U.S. exploring expedition in the 1830s that by that time was 100 years old. And not accurate, needless to say.
There's a lot of stories at the beginning of World War II like that.
Yeah,
sure. Ascension Island was built on one book. Yeah. The 6 Months on Ascension, written in 1830s.
Yeah, I mean, you have in the Pacific during World War II, you have a Navy that's grappling with huge expanses of water. And taking islands that nobody thought would be of any strategic importance until relatively close, even then, maybe not even, to the beginning of the war. How do you grapple with that in terms of getting scientific information about that stuff? Yeah.
We've got to get our midshipman to his 1330 class.
Okay.
And some faculty members will probably
Apologize for taking a little bit longer.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.